We'll get started again in about exactly a minute. People are still joining. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Claudia Regal. I'm the director of the City of New Orleans Mosquito, Termite, and Rodent Control Board. We've got here also Mrs. Stacia Carter, our Education and Outreach Coordinator. And we are so excited today to have our third installment of the Gulf South Vector webinar series. And today we have Dr. Ron Harrison who's going to be joining us to talk a little bit about what he does globally. But before we get started, I wanted to talk just briefly about what is the Gulf South Vector. So everybody has a little bit more information. But this is a CDC funded project that we're in the second half of the second year. And their goal with these projects is to strengthen the partnerships and capacity in really preventing vector-borne disease in the United States. So for this particular project, we're focusing on Texas through Florida. So many of you I see that are joined are in this region. And so these are some of our partners, and it is growing that are participating in here, but we have about 55 partners, people actually, that are in this project. So if this is something that you're interested in and want to learn more about, we're very much interested to speak with you. So that'd be great. There is a website for this project that talks a little bit more about the objectives, the purpose, and some of those partners. And you can find it at vectoroutreach.org. That's a great place too, where you can sign up to get more information and get posted, right, when we have these wonderful seminars available. Just a few housekeeping items. Please keep your line muted. And place your questions in the chat. So Stacia is going to be monitoring the chat throughout the meeting, and we have plenty of time here today to have Dr. Harrison answer your questions. This presentation is being recorded, and it's going to be placed on our YouTube channel, and there it is below. And actually, just there's some other great webinars on there as well, so that's something you might want to visit and subscribe to. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. A little bit about Dr. Harrison, and I will say colleague and friend, right? He's studied agronomy at the University of Utah some years ago, and then he has a master's in horticulture from University of Georgia, and also a PhD from the University of Georgia. He did his postdoctoral work in England and then also Florida, looking at biological control research programs. He's also very much involved in academia. He's a tenured professor at Mercer University, adjunct professor as well. He serves on a lot of committees with the ESA and Georgia, as well as also very much involved with the National Pest Management Association. Dr. Harrison's been employed by Rollins, Orkin since 1998. I know he did a lot of work in domestic technical training, but now he's the director of the Global Technical Services, and he provides counseling and technical matters to all kinds of field locations as well as the home office. And just a little side note, I love calling him because it's one of those things you never know where Dr. Harrison's going to be in the world. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Dr. Harrison and have him get started. Ron?
Thanks so much, Claudia. And it's my privilege to be with y'all and particularly work with Claudia, who's been a real example over the years. In fact, just a quick story, probably 10 years ago, maybe 15, she came over to UAE where I was working and supported us, but also did some other training for the projects over there. And I recall we were out in an oasis of a date palm oasis there, middle of the summer, hot and humid, and hundreds of technicians learning from her. So not only does she do spectacular work in the laboratory, but also understands what the field's all about as well. So today what I'd like to kind of chat about, and clearly if there are questions or misunderstandings that I hope I don't share anything, but please chat them in, and if it's an emergency, we can deal with it during the presentation, but I certainly happy to chat with it later. So these are some of the things that I'd like to talk about from my perspective in the pest control industry. And first of all, let's just get started about and I think this will give you a comparison between where we look at pest control in the United States versus globally. I don't know if anybody knows, but what is the economic value of pest control in the United States? And when we look at what that industry looks like, we generally, 12, $13 billion is kind of where it comes down. And so then you say, well, what about the global impact? And it's interesting that the US, even though the population here is relatively small compared to the whole world, we have more than 50% of that output for pest control, particularly in the urban or structural markets. So we would say 12 or 13 billion domestically, and maybe 17, 18 billion globally. So this, Claudia asked me to kind of look at from a global perspective a little bit, but the core of where pest control is really based here in the United States. There are outstanding pest control companies that are global, and there are chemical companies that are global, but the market is really targeted around, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to kind of talk about some of those opportunities, particularly globally, that exist, and some of the challenges that we face in the pest control industry, and then some of my ideas in the future where we want to go. So we'll kind of use this as an outline of the direction that we're going to go today. So on the next slide, I kind of wanted to give us a perspective of, and this isn't just domestic, but globally, what are we thought of in the pest control industry? Do our children hope or desire to be in this industry? Are we considered professional? And I want to step back because it's been, I guess, 10 years ago, but I was asked to do a presentation for the University of Georgia where they were getting continuing education units for the training that I was putting on. And so I kind of posed this question, what do the consumer, what do they think about us? And one of the gentlemen that had been in the industry a long period of time said, oh, they think that we are dumb and drunk. And I've long thought about that and what did I get myself into? I was a college professor in biology and entomology at Mercer University, and then I was recruited and came to Orkin, and I thought, is that what we're thought of? And I beg to differ with him, and maybe at some point that was the philosophy. But to help us put this all in perspective, I'd like to bring up what our value is. And if we think about history for a moment and go back to the 12, 13, 1400s, we're all aware of the plague and the impact it had on civilization. Many historians will tell us that a quarter to a third of the population died because of plague. Well, what was that based upon? And of course, we know that rodents were carriers of fleas that therefore would bite people and cause this horrendous death. But what stopped it? And from my perspective, first of all, what caused it, and then what stopped it? Let me start on the front end of what was maybe one of the causes. And tragically, around that period of time, that the church somehow spread or some reason, I don't quite understand that, said that black cats were evil and of the devil. And so there was quite a campaign to eliminate black cats. Well, the population of black cats declined, and then what did that lead to? Well, more than possible, an increase in rodent populations, which therefore led to this potential problem. But going on the backside of who solved it, there were a couple of things that were understood. First of all, if you were to keep rodents from your city, it appeared that the issue with plague was significantly reduced or eliminated. Who came up with that? And that was pest control professionals. And so whether that happened 1,200 years ago or today, we are significantly involved in health, protection of investments, and then giving people peace of mind. So this industry, and when I travel to Ghana, or I travel, particularly which has a problem with malaria and other types of mosquito-borne diseases, we are in the middle of all that. I think back the Zika virus scare that impacted Florida and other parts of the United States, where pregnant women that got bit by infected Aedes mosquitoes could cause birth defects. And again, who was on the front line to take care of that? Let's go back to COVID. Pest control operators were considered an essential service. And so whether we are dealing with mosquitoes or cockroaches or rodents, the industry, the pests that are associated with this industry cause health concerns. Now, I don't know about you, but I know the biggest investment that I have made in my life is my home. And every about 10 years, I do a new protection around my home to make sure that it's protected from termites and other types of pests. And interesting enough, it came home to me 2 years ago. I have a couple of big trees around my yard, and one of the limbs of a tree fell through my house. And so I had to get a big part of my house rebuilt. And the front wall, or the front part of my house, the tree exposed the studs that were behind the brick and the sheetrock, and there had been termite damage before I bought the house. So here, I'd been in it 20 years, but before that, here there was structural damage that I was unaware of. When I bought the house, it was cleared of termites, but certainly there was damage that I was unaware of. Now, this third piece is a little bit more, I think, Western oriented, US oriented. You know, folks here in the United States don't want pests at all, don't want a spider, don't want anything. And so therefore, we provide that service globally, not quite as severe if it's not causing a disease or not causing food damage, structural damage, then generally it's not as big a deal. But these are things that we need to be proud of in the pest control industry, whether it's domestically or globally, areas to pay attention to. So on the next slide, let me kind of share a little bit of what should be our responsibility when it comes to pest control. And I'm certainly not here to make any strong statements, but Dr. Regal was involved with this program in the United Arab Emirates. They decided about 15 years ago, the government decided that not only was education and healthcare a right to all citizens of their country, but pest control was also. And so therefore, Orkin supported that initiative and therefore opened up a huge operation with hundreds of technicians to be able to provide pest control for any citizen in the United Arab Emirates. And so therefore, if you came home and saw an American cockroach come out of your drain, if you went to bed and there was a bed bug that crawled out, if you were bitten by mosquitoes, you'd make one phone call. It would send it to us as in our call center there in the United Arab Emirates, and we would send someone out the next day to take care of it. And so part of that was training, and that's where Dr. Regal and her team came over and did extensive training, because to keep the technicians to the level that they needed to be. So I asked that question as kind of as a model. What is our model for pest control globally? And I think most of us are attending this from the United States. But should there be some type of standard in which we provide pest control for citizens? And, I'm not here to say yay or nay, but clearly sometimes the courts get involved in that. We had a situation where a mother called us and in a frantic concern said, I've got a cockroach problem in my home. I need it taken care of immediately. And further discussion found out that there was a custody battle over children between her and her husband had accused her of having cockroaches in the home. And therefore the judge said, from her vantage point, that the cockroaches were a potential harm to the children, and therefore, as long as cockroaches were in the home, children couldn't go to that home. So, what would have happened if she couldn't have afforded a pest control service? Should there be some type of support when it comes to pest control? And United Arab Emirates is the first country that I'm aware of that actually initiated this type of a program. Now, since that time, Oman has worked on a similar type of program. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has as well. So, you see this beautiful picture there of Dubai, but is there some type of a standard that we ought to have globally? I think this kind of picture or the kind of question brings that up. So next slide, I'd like to kind of expand a little bit on that. And those US standards, so here we have a standard in United Arab Emirates, which is higher than US standards. And how should that be maintained? Now, let me kind of move into another standard. So the US has stated and not only stated, but developed a law, the Food Safety Modernization Act, which now I guess is almost 10 years old, kind of took over some other laws that were on the books. And that law, therefore, says that food from field to fork should be safe to consumers. And so in the United States, there is a lot of inspection and auditing done to ensure that happens. So I was just recently in Amman, Jordan, just right before Christmas, and we put on a seminar for the industry, just any food. Philip Morris from the tobacco industry did, McDonald's was there, candy company, a lot of folks were there, over 100, in which we talked about standards. And so one candy producer said, I need help with FSMA. And of course, this is Amman, Jordan. And, I'm a little bit surprised. And so we went to do an inspection and support his facility the next day, and come to find out that the US government, Food and Drug Administration, had sent people to his facility to inspect because he ships or exports candy to the United States. And so therefore, here you have these standards in the United States that are bleeding over into other countries. Now, if you're not producing or exporting to the United States, then the laws will be different. But these are all different types of standards that are utilized globally. Some of them are very specific to certain areas of the globe, but I have found in every country that I go that one of these or multiple of these will be required. And so in the United States, we understand these different types of auditing or standards, but globally, they are slowly being implemented as well. And let me kind of give an offshoot. So we service Yum brands, which are KFC and Pizza Hut and several others in many countries. And their standards they try to make sure that they're universal. And so therefore, whether you're going to eat at Pizza Hut in Cairo or in the United States, it should be the same type of standards. And they're working on that. And so therefore, we come in and therefore the pest control professional comes in and therefore has to maintain those standards because the expectation is the same. Same with McDonald's and many others of these global companies. So in Jordan, therefore, it was interesting that even though they didn't have to have that standard for the candy that they were selling locally or even in the region, they had to have it. Now, a little side note, I was in Guatemala and working on a challenging cockroach problem in a food manufacturer that made refried beans. And so the challenge that we came up with is, how do you manage it? And we were working through it. And I said, what do you do with your refried beans? And the answer was, we ship them to the United States. And I said, not in this facility, because it just didn't live up to the standards. And they said, oh, well, we have another facility. So interesting enough, the facility that they showed to the auditors from the United States was one that wasn't used very much. It was maintained differently than the main one that was making the refried beans and putting in cans, which ultimately were being shipped, but the government was being fooled. Next, I'd like to kind of talk about how we define a pest. And so I'm going to use an example, but I think I talked to Dr. Regal about this, but I was in Amman, Jordan, excuse me, I was in Amman, and the Shangri-La called us and said, our guests, when they go out in the gardens, I think I've got a slide that can show this, but sorry, it goes a little further. That's okay, we'll go back to this. And they were saying that mosquitoes were biting people, but the guests loved watching the butterflies and the bees. So here you had a conflict between a pest, and let's talk about two others as well. So termites. When I asked the question, do you have termites, or are termites a pest? And most of us would say yes. Well, if they're invading my house, well, certainly they fit that definition, don't they? But out in my yard, I've got about an acre. And if a pine tree falls down during a storm or whatever, and if it's not directly where the lawn is or other types of vegetation, yeah, I'll just leave it. And therefore, termites after 3 or 4 years have completely eaten it and put it back in the ground. So the pest is based on what it's doing and where it's at. In my yard, termites are fine. In my house, they're not acceptable. I was recently in Hong Kong where talking to a hospital, and they are using at times blowflies to eliminate pieces of tissue that have died before they kind of stitch it up. And so here you have, in that situation, a very sterile environment where you raise the blowflies sterilely. They feed on this loose tissue that's dead anyway, and then they're able to heal much better. So first of all, we have to ask the question, what is the pest, and then how we go about managing it. So on the next slide, then, I think I get into a little bit more specifics of what are those pests. And so here, all of us that have been involved with pest control would immediately say, yes, German cockroaches are pests. But when you travel, and I think some of the recent work that Dr. Colby Shaw has done is that they've traced this natural environment in either northern India, maybe Myanmar, some into the jungles of Thailand. And so in those environments, certainly they're not a pest, but in our homes, they certainly are and cause issues associated with respiratory problems and the disease transmission. And even there's stories of where they've crawled into people's ears and had to be surgically removed. So this one is a defined pest globally, whether I'm in Masai Mara, working with pest issues in people's homes there, or in the United States, or in a Starbucks in England. This fits the definition of pest, as does the next slide being a rodent. Norway rats in general would be across the board a pest. Now, interesting enough, I think most of the literature says, well, these Norway rats come from Mongolia or China or some of the areas that kind of steppe area, rangeland areas. But I was recently in Mongolia doing a training for our folks over there. And, I didn't do my homework, which was unfortunate. And they said, well, we don't have rats here. And I thought, what? You should, that mice are the big problem, and a very serious problem. So therefore, again, the location you're at will actually determine what kind of the pest that you're going to be dealing with. But across the board, Norway rats in general, I would say, are kind of a metropolitan or a universal pest that we run into. Now, going back to some of the work that Dr. Regal has been involved with, our contract in UAE when we started was to manage camels. Which of course was kind of a new thing for, well, not kind of, it was a new thing for me. Of course, I'd seen camels before, but in UAE, they wander. The land is, particularly in the desert areas, are available to anyone. And so these get out of their areas. There's not fences. They're just kind of wandering. And so we had to prepare our contracts to be able to manage this pest or this animal, and in certain, and interesting enough, the law says that all camels have to be chipped. And so therefore, even if it was wandering wherever and was considered somewhat of a pest, we could retrieve it, check the chip, and therefore try to have the owner come back and pick it up. If we could not locate the owner, then we would have to deliver it to a slaughterhouse. And so we had to have big trucks. We had to learn how do you catch a camel? How do you get a camel into a truck? So it fit the situation where, this was a pest in that type of a situation. So I think it's an interesting when we look at globally, pests, that definition sometimes changes. If we can move to the next slide, and in public, we'll just go back to that one there for a minute, but in public areas, or the previous slide, talks about all of the pests that really do cause public health issues, whether that's cockroaches. I want to stop there on houseflies for just a moment, because globally, houseflies are our number one pest. If I was to ask the question domestically, most pest control professionals, and I don't know, Claudia, you can chirp in on this, but generally we would say that cockroaches may be second, but ants lead the group. But globally, ants are generally not thought of as too negative, don't cause too much damage, and so houseflies are always raised to the top. But these are some of the pests that globally we look at that do cause public health issues. Fleas have moved down. I know years ago that was a pretty big one. And in the United States, I picked these here as a global list, but probably we would say that ticks are probably one of the top issues associated with health concerns, below maybe, I think even higher than mosquitoes. But of course, globally, we would say that mosquitoes are the most dangerous animal that's out there. So can we solve these pest issues? And so I thought about mosquitoes for just a moment, and or other types of disease, transmitted diseases by mosquitoes. But let's think about this, and I'll hopefully have time to chat a little bit further on. But what impact do mosquitoes or these diseases have on humans? And therefore, what can we do about it? And I was recently in Nigeria, and their big issue, we were, I guess it was a year ago, but we were celebrating World Pest Day. And the entire discussion was about mosquitoes and the concerns and how you're going to deal with malaria and able to solve it. And we all know that a lot of times an IPM program involves cultural control mechanisms. So let me give an example then about a pest that's a global pest like mosquitoes. And as I said earlier, 1 to 2 million people die. So clearly, because of mosquito, clearly that becomes an issue. So this picture of Oman, I wanted to kind of piggyback. This was the example of the Shangri-La, which I talked about earlier, that customers wanted to go out and see this beautiful garden. On the other hand, they would go out and get bit by mosquitoes. And so what do? Can we really solve a situation where you've got two conflicting animals there? And can you do that? Well, in reference to dengue, which was a problem in Singapore, there was some really nice work done by the country, where if you had any type of standing water that was a breeding site for Aedes mosquitoes, you would be fined by the government. And so they were basically able to eliminate dengue issues in Singapore because of the community involvement and the consequences that happened. But going back to this Oman situation, so I was in Oman, I knew about what had happened in Singapore. They asked me what we should do. And I said, well, let's just implement the program that was very successful in Singapore. And it was a complete failure because the culture in Oman was very different. The income that people make there is significantly higher than the income that is in Singapore. And so therefore people said, I don't care about this fine. It doesn't make an issue. And so therefore culture impacts the success of managing a pest. Now let me go to this, and if you were in a live group with me, I would say if you were given the assignment at the Shangri-La to manage the mosquitoes but not harm the butterflies and the honeybees and the other pollinators, what would be your answer? Is there a possibility? Can we solve those problems? And I personally believe that you can solve the problems. Sometimes it's more intense in the service. But pest control is always based currently on science, and IPM programs, therefore, will tell us that what are the breeding sites of the mosquitoes? Which mosquito species actually is it? Because Aedes don't fly very far. So if you can get rid of breeding sites in these areas, then you may be able to eliminate the mosquitoes that are causing the problems. Also about that, mosquitoes are usually active in the evening. I know that Dr. Regal and her team does a lot of their mosquito work at dusk or early in dawn. I know that's the work we were doing in Oman. And so therefore, if you do mosquito work then, you're not impacting the butterflies and bees that are active during the day. Also, what are the resting sites? Mosquitoes are resting on the underside of leaves rather than on the top flower areas in general. And so therefore, if you treat underneath the leaf, you're going to impact the mosquito and won't impact the flower itself. We did some very nice work where we would come through and mow, particularly clovers that were in the middle of grass, to discourage, because therefore with no clovers, there wasn't any pollination going on, and then we could come in and do a treatment. So understanding the pest, understanding the situation, I think all ties into that you can manage a pest and not completely harm another pest. Now, having said that, and I don't know if Dr. Regal has experienced this, but the biggest complaint of homeowners in reference to Orkin in the United States taking care of their mosquito problem is that the lightning bugs, the fireflies are gone as well. And so clearly we haven't completely refined our service. And so people will call and say, you know, I don't want you to hurt my fireflies. And they are resting in the same area that mosquitoes are resting. They are active during the middle of, in the evenings, kind of the same time that mosquitoes are. So that's one that we haven't completely solved. But clearly there is an opportunity to be able to manage a pest and support one that we don't consider to be a pest. So if we'll go to the next slide. Now, I gave that list of pests that are impactful on human health. And there's a big difference. So I am down in Brazil, I see these type of pictures and I say, well, let's solve the problem. And you cannot kill any bird in Brazil, particularly pigeons and some of the others. In the United States, we have determined that 3 species of birds are non-native to this country, and so therefore can be killed if that is needed. Now, sometimes socially, that's not the best thing to do, but we can, but in Brazil and in other countries, same problem was happening in Saudi Arabia. In fact, on the interesting side, you say, what leads to these potential pests? Well, religion sometimes leads to these pests. The Prophet Muhammad said, feed and care for pigeons. And so folks, therefore, in the Muslim belief, will quite actively take care for with water and food, which therefore leads to challenges like this. And then when we can't kill them, it is a challenge. So with wildlife, with birds, often we have to be very cautious because there's a different standard between what the US says and what global challenges actually are. Next slide kind of ties into this concept. You know, and I'll show a picture. I think the next slide is Masai Mara, but you know, when you have a circumstance like this is people's home. Native folks, the Maasai, Samburu, other groups live in a structure like, how are we going to protect this home from termites? And termites are everywhere out in Kenya and other locations, Tanzania and the like. And so when I have conversations with these folks, they'll say, look, we plan on, and because many of them are pastoral anyway, why they weren't so worried about a house surviving forever, like my house in Atlanta that's, you know, I'm 75 years old. But it does lead to challenges when I need to do some type of a treatment strategy for a home like this that is much more exposed to the ground, much more less, you know, in the United States, we have usually some type of foundation that's made out of some type of concrete or here you have no foundation. You're basically going directly into the soil, so that soil to wood contact leads for, you know, particularly easy entrance there. So not only are you dealing with construction issues that are challenging throughout the world, but also cultural issues that are associated with that as well. So so issues or pest issues are relatable until the specific condition and culture that's involved in. Now, let me then kind of move. So we've talked about pests and we've talked about service strategies associated with it. I would like to talk about a couple of other unique challenges or issues that we run into. And Dr. Regal and her team have been involved with training globally and particularly in UAE. So I wanted to kind of touch on some of these challenges. So the first time that I went and did some global training, I guess it's 20 years ago or 25 years ago, my concept was I'm going to the Middle East. I understand that they speak Arabic. I'll have a translator to help me. But when I went, I realized that those that I was training were not Arab-speaking folks. They had come from India and Pakistan. They had come from the Philippines. They had come from Nepal. And so therefore, I was in a classroom, which people who had said, oh, we speak English, but didn't really speak English. They got that to get entered into the country. And so we were literally having 4 or 5 different languages that were being spoken. I also recall that I was having a very hard time understanding some of the students. And I said, look, I only speak English. And they responded, well, we're speaking English. And so not only sometimes do you have language issues, but then you have accents that can lead to unique challenges. Just recently, I was in Oman, as I mentioned, and doing some training there. And I had a presentation that was scheduled to last 45 minutes. Well, when you're having translation, it takes twice as long. And so therefore, the amount of content that you can get over is limited as well. Second thing with training that I'd like to talk about is the first bullet point. So how do you talk about, well, one of the issues that we run into is why would pests migrate or move from one place to another? And we know that bed bugs will do that they will migrate from place to place. And in reference to that, that migration, why does that happen? And so it depends on the scientist you talk to, but some do believe that possibly that's due to traumatic insemination. And so to help get the point across that you need to inspect surrounding rooms of a bed bug infestation, I will often talk about traumatic insemination. And I have found myself, the translator just not talking about that, not just going silent. And I look at them and I say, well, do you not understand the words, kind of what's going on with this? And responses are, that's just not appropriate. The room is just gentlemen, that will get them excited. And so culturally, I have had to adjust sometimes the things that I talk about, how I talk about it, because it may not always fit. And with that as well, if I go to a training session in the Middle East, my traditional method of greeting is to shake people's hands. But if there are women there, I cannot. And so therefore, how do I make people feel warm and accepting in an environment where the culture is very, very different? Vice versa, if I go to a training here in the United States and I don't shake everybody's hand, then particularly women, then they're going to be offended. Another challenging situation is what is the training environment like? We have learned, and if you ever go and listen to Dr. Regal's presentations, they're interesting and engaging and sometimes amusing. And I was in UAE, one of the managers came by and just got very angry with the students because they were laughing at some of the things that we were talking about. We've learned in the United States anywhere that if you keep the room lively and engaged, you're going to learn a lot more. But certainly that doesn't always fit, and certainly in certain environments and stuff. So training can be very different between cultures. Students in certain locations will not even comment. You'll try to get engagement, and they are so trained in an environment that you just sit and listen and take notes. And with that, sometimes in a less, I guess, structural training, maybe something is said a little bit confusing or incorrect, and many cultures will just live by the words that you actually say. And also, the science can be tricky, and so even translators may not. I know just Republic of Georgia and Tbilisi that we had to spend several hours with my translator to make sure that he understand all of the words, all of the specifics, because many of the words that in the scientific realm, he just wasn't aware of. Okay, let's move to the next slide. So what are then opportunities in the pest control world, and how does that fit in domestically as well as globally? And we would probably say in general, sales and service and administration would be somewhat the same globally. But these are all lists of things that are different, even in sales. In the Caribbean, we still have yellow pages as a sales technique or a marketing technique. We have really migrated significantly to more online activities in many areas, and in others, not that way. We wanted a live interaction. Let's talk about leadership methodologies. We have in the US, kind of supportive leadership or service leadership is kind of the terminology. In other locations, it's still very hardcore leadership in which that you listen and you just go do it. So opportunities are broad, whether you're involved in sales or service or the legal department or government departments. Let me come down to the end, because if you use a product and some type of pesticide in the United States, there's a very clear label, and should you do anything opposed to that label, then there are consequences, and those consequences can go all the way from some type of a fine to another type of even prison or jail time. So I was recently in Egypt, and we were having that conversation, and I said, okay, pull out the label, and we were reviewing the label, and one of the Orkin professionals responded and said, do we really have to put this product in a void? And I said, yeah, that's what the label says, and it's clear. And I said, and of course, there's a consequence. And they started to laugh. They said, there are no consequences here in Egypt. No one inspects what we do. And if they did find out that this dust was put into a crack rather than into a void, that there would be no consequence. And so even though many of the standards globally are based upon stringent requirements in China or the US, USDA or EPA, excuse me, or in Europe, that the enforcement is not there. I'll give another example. So I am a real strong supporter of insect growth regulators, particularly for German cockroaches in environments where it's quite difficult to clean. So you have a very dirty environment or a cluttered environment, hard to get rid of all the food, and maybe a kitchen that's very busy. It doesn't matter. And so an insect growth regulator can give me long-term support. Well, insect growth regulators are not labeled or available in many countries. And you'll say, well, why not? Well, how much insect growth regulator is going to be sold? And so Egypt is an emerging market. We just, since Orkin came there 8 years ago, finally now it is progressing. So a manufacturer, Zoicon or one of them that manufactured insect growth rate, or TechoPro, which is made by Control Solutions, why would they register a product that's going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, generally many years, when they're not going to get the return on that? And so I thought, well, I guess I shouldn't talk about it. Well, because there is really no enforcement in very tough situations. Sometimes the owner, who's an American, will bring in a little bit and be able to take care of it. So these opportunities are interesting when we talk about whether it's legal or government. The country that we deal with it'll impact the severity or the use of the actual product. Okay, so these are opportunities that are global. They're different globally where you actually go. We'll go to the next slide. Now, let me talk about this a little bit, then we'll go on to the challenges that we kind of face. And especially with Dr. Riegel being here and her heavy involvement with the science and the education. Orkin uses a used to use, I don't know if it's still in our marketing material, but pest control down to a science. And going back to my original comment that, the pest control industry is looked at as being drunk and dumb, I hope we've changed this, particularly with the outreach programs that Dr. Regal does in New Orleans and throughout and globally, with the beautiful science that she actually does, and then educates to go along with it. And then nicely, are we coming behind the service and making sure that it's done as it should be? One of the opportunities that I really like most about my job is that I am able to try and raise the standard of pest control globally. I remember I was in Pakistan, it's probably been 7 years, and we were doing seminars, IPM seminars throughout the country, particularly the biggest cities, so Karachi and Lahore, Islamabad and Peshawar. And food processors and food distributors and would come to our seminar and say, we've read about, we went to school and learned about integrated pest management, and now you've brought it. We now officially know that there's a company here that's providing IPM. And so this science-based approach to what we do is huge. And the partnerships that we have globally, it's a joy. I just not long ago had the opportunity to be a speaker at the Philippine Pest Control Association meetings. And several other scientists, some from Asia, others here in the United States, were there providing the most up-to-date scientific information on termites and bed bugs and other types of pests. Again, we've touched on a little bit on the challenges that come along with education, but the quality is where we really have to continue to ensure that not only do we teach and do research, but we also make sure that the service is at the level it ought to be. We'll move to the next. So what are some of these industry challenges that we have? And so I want to touch on this kind of fits globally as well as domestically. So let's use this first step of competition. I go to Guatemala or I go to Indonesia, and big major companies are there. And so therefore, how do we compete, or how does anyone compete? Well, it comes down to, are we basing our service on what works, or are we just going through motions? Another challenge we face is that labor challenges. So in Egypt, people are getting paid a few dollars an hour versus $15 to $20 an hour here in the United States. And so literally I was in one of the hotels in Egypt, serious pest control issues. We were proposing taking care of the problem. And as I was watching in the dining room, there was someone there with a fly swatter, not only one that physically used, but one that the electronic. And I'm saying, look, we don't need to do that. But the labor costs were so low, it was economical to have someone walk around during the breakfast hours and actually do that. We touched on government enforcement issues, and those, what are the standards? What does the government expect? In UAE, and this is where Dr. Regal has been, their standards, enforcement, and auditing is very similar to what we experience in the United States. Go to some other of the Gulf countries and you don't see that. We've touched on pests, but I'd like to kind of jump back in that. What is the future? And, if you go back to the turn of the century, we didn't have any bed bugs before that all of a sudden we're dealing with a bed bug issue. A marmorated stink bug is an issue that has come up. The lanternfly is another issue. So are we ready for new pests when they get introduced? There's been studies that have been done at looking at imported containers. And Dr. Dan Suter has done some very interesting work at the port of Savannah, where he opened up a wide range of imported containers and found significant numbers that had animals inside of it. Some of them were dead, some of them were alive. But are we prepared then for the pests? What skills are needed in Amman, which I was there, same as in Egypt, all of the technicians there are degreed engineers. So usually agriculture engineers, some of them are veterinarians. And so is that the challenge, that we're moving towards a more degreed group of folks? Just got off a phone call before this one with folks in Cambodia. They are wanting to get their associate certified entomology degree, or certificate, I guess is a better term, so that they feel like those skills will be able to be utilized fully. Time, giving you kind of an interesting example. We're almost finished here, but in Egypt, when they started, the owner there came to the United States, saw that how Orkin uses trucks, so went back and bought trucks, and realized that the traffic was so bad that he couldn't get to any accounts. Therefore, then they moved to motorcycles and found out that motorcycles were being stolen. And so now we have no vehicles whatsoever in Egypt. Everything is public transportation. I had the opportunity of riding with our technicians in London, England, and we actually had 27 stops in one day because there was no vehicles. We went from place to place very close to each other. And so therefore, this issue of can we do the service in an appropriate amount of time? And I have touched therefore on the time, on the training issues as well. So we'll move to the next slide. So just very brief here, just to touch, I started in training is kind of where I got going with at Orkin. I had come from a kind of a non-traditional training program at Mercer University. And just quickly in the next slide, what we want to do is bridge the gap. And what I mean by that is do you have top performers, and how do I get the average performer to get to that? And I would ask you to really evaluate that, because too much of our training is content-based rather than change-based, rather than saying, this is where they are, this is what I need to do. We just give content and actually forget that. So the future of pest control, do we ask the same question globally as we ask domestically? And I'm going to say no to that. We want the same standard, but in our global, in the United States, at least 50% of the services that we perform are domestic. But globally, it's very, very few. Very few people have reached that or have decided that they want that globally. And so I think one has to really analyze. We all want a certain standard, but there are different rules, regulations, and at this point, there is a big difference. And I would say that we concentrate particularly on commercial globally. The Food Safety Modernization Act has forced countries, therefore, if they're going to import to the United States, to kind of achieve that standard that is particularly found in the United States or in the West. Now, my last question to you, and this is just theoretical, philosophical, I guess, is who is going to win? So when you look at the future, are we going to get control of the pest? Sometimes we worry that if we manage the pest for a customer, they won't need us anymore. And I've had the fortune to be in pest control now as an entomology for about 40 years, but I have been with Orkin for going on 30 years, or in pest control specifically. And the revenue if you want to go by revenue, we were less than $1 billion company. Now we're a $4 billion company. When you look at the opportunities that are out there, I think they're going to continue. Pests are becoming resistant to pesticides, and so therefore there's more programs that need to be taken care of. It's how do we actually go about doing it? And so I think that the pest control industry is very healthy if we're willing to make those changes that need to happen. So having said that, then, I think we're at the end of where I'm at. And so I think I'd like to open it up. I planned this for about an hour. Are there any questions or comments that anyone would like to make that have come up in the chat that I can help with?
Yes, Dr. Harrison, one of the first questions was, what is your opinion on programs separating some mosquitoes as pests and other as vectors?
So that I love that question. And if I was speaking from an operational standpoint at Rollins, I would answer it differently. But from a pure scientific IPM standard, I think that should happen. So let me throw this out. And I know, if time goes over, some of you can leave if you need to. But to run a company or a business, we have to say to a customer, we're going to start doing your service for mosquitoes. And we're using that as an example. Let's say in the Atlanta market, we're going to start in March and we're going to end in October. Well, what if we have a very cold winter, activity doesn't start? Is that what we do? Well, the budgets all say, well, you got to start doing it in April because we got to make our budgets. But really what should happen is there should be methodology that we inspect, we do trapping, and therefore we react to that. Now, some of the smart mosquito machines do that. They, give us a report saying you have Aedes now, you have Culex now, you need to react, the population is this. But globally, we don't do like what we should. So I would say yes, in general, we should be more specific about the pest and more targeted. But if I go talk to senior management, they're going to say, Ron, that doesn't work. And I'll give you kind of an interesting example. The safety and health folks here at Orkin came to me and said, when bed bugs started becoming a problem, we're having a lot of incidences of people complaining of back injuries and problems. And so they said, tell me about your bed bug service. So I explained that we needed to lift up the beds. We had to treat the beds. We put encasements around the beds. And so, yes, it was a wise thing. And I'm not a big guy, but yeah, it was nice to have someone else there to help me with, a queen size mattress to move things around. So he said, well, Dr. Harrison said that we need 2 people on bed bug jobs. Well, that went up to senior management and I got a call from the president saying, who are you to tell me how to operate our business? Which was true. If they have to send 2 people out to do a job that used to only take 1 person, anyone that's in the pest control side will realize that. So that goes the same with mosquitoes. It's easy for me to sit in my office and say, yes, we need to be specific about what mosquito is there. Why are we spraying for a mosquito that isn't even biting people or isn't transmitting disease or isn't, as worrisome? But having said that, to put that into an economic, and Claudia asked me to talk from a pest control standpoint, being in the business and being part of Orkin, that doesn't always work. So thanks for the question. Scientifically, I'd say yes. Practically, sometimes no.
The next question is, where did you see a better level of pest control operators worldwide?
So with the theory of everyone getting pest control, there's nothing better than UAE. On the other hand, the level of starting out there was very low. We had people that had no experience. Now, after 15 years of doing that, the level has progressed. But I would still say that generally, the West, and that's a tough term, but the United States, Canada, Europe, I see just because I think the expectation of the consumer is significantly higher than in other locations, and it probably has to do with economics. You have a higher economic standard in those locations than you do in others. I almost wanted to cry when I went to some of the villages in Kenya. They had bed bugs in their huts or homes. They had German cockroaches, American cockroaches, and then they had spiders that were feeding on all of that. And so therefore, it's hard to raise a standard of pest management if that's kind of the environment that you're coming home to. So Singapore, we have a big operation in Singapore, beautiful, really nice technicians, are well educated. Australia kind of fits that. So, but having said that, I was in Cote d'Ivoire, and I hope Claudia can go with me to some of these. Those technicians there are top notch. So when you train them, and to the levels that they need to be, it's across the board. But if you just pick the average, I would say that US, Canada, Singapore, a little more affluent countries seem to have a little better pest control.
Okay, those are all the questions I see in the chat. If you have any other questions, you can either email us or Dr. Harrison, and we will get the questions answered. Thank you for coming to our webinar today. For more upcoming events, to get notifications, please visit www.vectoroutreach.org. Dr. Janet McAllister from Mosquito Control and NEHA will present a seminar on insecticide resistance on January 16th, 2025. For more information about that, please visit the NEHA website. And then also we are hosting, along with other people such as GNOPCA and LPMA, the New Orleans Urban Pest Management Symposium, January 28th through the 31st, 2025 at Gallier Hall. For more information, you can scan the QR code or once again, email us at either education@nola.gov or vectoroutreach@nola.gov. Once again, I want to thank you for joining us this morning for our webinar. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Dr. Harrison.
Okay,
Thank you to
thank you.
Stacy, and thank you everybody for joining.
See you later. Thank you.